So for much of history, we thought that poverty is not an accidental byproduct of other things. It's actually created by design.
Everybody wants to be seen. Everybody needs to be validated. And that in and of itself heals. And we begin there. And everything comes after that. You build a foundation in trust and hope, and everything else will follow.
You pour more money into it, it doesn't go away. What you have to do is take it down on this real micro level. So let's just take one homeless person. Let's just say with one homeless person that we pour a ton of resources into that one person. Will their problems be fixed? Not necessarily. Depends on the problem.
So in some ways, the city becomes the worst possible environment for someone suffering with this illness. They are bombarded by strangers. They have a tremendous need to be both flexible and conforming through hundreds of interactions in just the course of one day.
That's why people with schizophrenia do better in third world countries than they do in America, because they aren't excluded and intolerant.
The growth rate of the population is slowing down, but it's growing off a huge base. 1% or 1.2 billion, 12 to 15 million, that is one New York City every year, being added year after year.
Just when we are poised to become the youngest country as in country with maximum number of young people in the world, we definitely need our young adolescents. We definitely need to invest money, resources, everything in this young population, because they're going to be the tomorrow of India and the world.
There are politically powerful actors who make decisions largely understanding, largely aware that this is going to create benefits for their group, for their supporters, for their cronies, and at the expense of others. And that's really at the root of the problem of inequality in the world.
The idea that the homeless population gets dehumanized is a very real one. You just shut your eyes to it. You turn it off, you walk past the guy, you skip over him, you ignore people, you avoid the smell, the glances, everything, the bother, and pretty soon it's a hassle. And the homeless community gets dehumanized. You hear it every day when people use the homeless as a noun. Let's go feed the homeless. Yeah. Look at the homeless.
We're people.
Yes.
I ask every day, I question in my head, why? Why are there so many black folks living in Skid Row? Why? As Pastor Q said the other day, it's just another reservation that we've been exiled to.
I'm thinking of that situation where this young man was 18, and all we could think about was, where were we, all of us, the system, everything, when he was 12?
It is the birthright of a child to have a family, right? It's the legal and moral obligation of the systems that surround them to find them a family. And miserable failures 20,000 times year over year on the system's part that we didn't find them a family.
That's somebody's mom, or that's somebody's grandma, or that was somebody's daughter. That's a human being who something happened in their lives that was often beyond their control, and they're not starting from the same place that we're starting from.
If we don't engage the community, I think we won't be able to find a solution.
I challenged the mayor's office a few months ago, maybe got in a little bit of trouble, when they made this audacious claim that they were going to end chronic homelessness by the end of 2016. What are you actually saying? What are you going to end? With who? And how are you going to do that? And where are these 60,000 units of housing going to be?
Wade Trimmer was referring to the claim made by Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti when he took office in 2013. His sales pitch was simple. In 1906, the San Francisco earthquake, which left over 200,000 people homeless, was addressed with an urgent need to rebuild the city and rapidly construct temporary housing for the victims of California's greatest natural disaster. They did it in a matter of years. Why can't we do the same thing for Los Angeles now? This is the wealthiest country in the world. Why can't we fix this? That's a question of our times that has so many frustrated and confused. Why does the richest country in the world have such a high homeless population in its largest cities? It's a lot more complicated than people want it to be. But before we address that issue, let's try and get an idea of the wealth, size, and struggles of nations in general, and look at one of the most complicated systems on the planet: India. It's difficult to think of India as its own country. It would be more appropriate to call it its own world in relation to the rest, as is true with China. Their size in comparison to everyone else is incomparable, even with countries whose populations are in the hundreds of millions. And most don't exceed 100 million. In fact, only 13 of them do. The Philippines barely making the mark. These 13 countries house over 4.6 billion of the global population. So of the 233 countries and territories recognized by the United Nations, only 13 of them are home to over 60% of humanity. Then there are 14 with a population less than 100 million and more than 50 million. In between 50 and 30 million, there are 17. There are 42 in between 10 and 30 million. The remaining 144 all have populations less than 10 million, and if you combine them, they are just slightly larger than the population of the United States. In recent years, a handful of these smaller nations started to appear attractive on paper when considering some of their social programs. The Scandinavians in particular, Sweden being the largest of these countries with a population of 10 million, Finland, Norway, and Denmark all with populations smaller than Massachusetts. Although they currently have strong institutions of welfare generated from high rates of taxation, up until fairly recently, prior to the post-industrial age, historically they've significantly lacked in the development of new technologies and entrepreneurship. They've also benefited significantly from countries that have excelled in those spaces. What about a smaller, wealthier per capita country like Switzerland, that the United States recently tried to borrow the concept of compulsory health insurance from, ultimately demonstrating how cronyism in a much larger system can hijack and degenerate a well-intended program, creating more problems than solutions. Switzerland seems utopian by design. It's one of the wealthiest per-person countries in the world, with a recent GDP per capita of $80,000. It's a low taxation, affordable healthcare, high life expectancy, low poverty rate, high standard of living first world country. With a population of roughly 8 million, they produced $700 billion in 2017. The same amount the United States spent on the military the following year. And that budget is used to protect the interests of many allied European nations. So, they're wealthier per person, less bureaucratic due to a smaller body to govern, and don't share the same burdens as more powerful nations. The military is just one example. This is not to say that Switzerland has nothing to offer in terms of lessons from their practices. They definitely do. And at the end of the day, we have more similarities than differences. The point is to suggest the lack of efficiency in larger systems. The greater the population, the more difficult it is to mitigate their socioeconomic complications. It should be obvious that the size of a population brings about unique struggles, and if the country is poor on top of that, those struggles increase exponentially. So to get some perspective of India's size instead, it's a country 4 times the population of the United States, and 150 times the population of Switzerland. If India did everything in terms of policy and programs that Switzerland did, would their economy and living standards turn out to be the same? Perhaps over time, but it would have to be a great deal of time. With a country 150 times the population, the economy is currently only 3 times the size. And that wealth and the government power it influences is locked up into a very few small groups of people. If the largest company in India, Tata Group, took their 2017 revenue totaling $100 billion, note that's only 9% less than Microsoft made that year. If they gave all of that income to Switzerland, the wealth per person of one of the richest GDP per capita nations would expand another 14%. And that's just one company, which also turns out to be about 4% of everything India produced that year. Now what if Switzerland as a whole nation gave all of its revenue to India? On second thought, forget that scenario, since the impact would be so inconsequential it really isn't worth thinking about. Consider this instead. If the entire world, every country on the planet, took all of the money produced in 2017 and gave all of it to India, they would still be $15,000 a head shy of what Switzerland produced that year. Now, this analysis has obvious weaknesses, since formulas such as the purchasing power parity couldn't even be assessed if a scenario like this were even possible. The objective is to stimulate thought and focus one's meditation towards the fact that size of a population complicates things. It makes audits less accurate and bureaucracies less efficient, and presents a whole host of other obstacles to overcome. The endless list of obstacles that India has to overcome makes it the most challenging socioeconomic puzzle in the post-industrial era to solve. We just don't have an example to follow when it comes to dealing with all of their difficulties. So if we were to focus only on larger nations, which ones are actually successful in terms of economic stability and social progress, and which ones have not been able to make the mark? Of the 13 largest populations previously mentioned, only Japan and the United States seem to make it in terms of gross domestic product per capita and quality of living standards. Granted, the GDP per capita is a blunt instrument in understanding the wealth of a nation, but it gives us a basic idea of how much capital there is to go around on an annual basis. Who would come next in the population bracket? Most would guess China, but that's a matter of perspective. The country as a whole is one of the wealthiest in nominal figures, and if you separate certain regions from it like Macau, which is seated in one of China's 4 free market special economic zones, it would be considered the wealthiest nation per head. But the nation as a whole usually ranks in the 70s of the GDP per capita when adjusted by the purchasing power parity, and 5th of countries in excess of 100 million inhabitants. Russia is the 3rd with $26,000, and the next is Mexico with $18,900 per head. The rest are increasingly worse, ending with Ethiopia coming in last place at $1,900 a head. The question is, why is there such a small rate of success in these larger countries? We could add a few more to the list of successful nations, although in a slightly smaller bracket, such as the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and South Korea. A few countries whose population exceed 50 million, powerful countries with first world standards of living. How did it come to pass that these nations thrive while others struggle? And most do struggle regardless of the size of the population. One of the most compelling arguments to explain this comes from the 15-year academic venture realized in a book by Daron Ashmoglu and James A. Robinson, titled Why Nations Fail. The cover art of the text features a now famous location in Bombay called Dhobi Ghat. It's fitting for the cover of the project since it represents a method of the old which is still implemented today in a society that was left behind at the turn of the Industrial Revolution. Failing to innovate or integrate technologies intentionally so that the wealthy elite were not challenged.
So for much of history, we thought that poverty is not an accidental byproduct of other things. It's actually created by design. That there are politically powerful actors, kings, monarchs, dictators, sometimes democratic politicians, sometimes business leaders, sometimes community leaders, who make decisions largely understanding, largely aware that this is going to create benefits for their group, for their supporters, for their cronies, and at the expense of others. And that's really at the root of the problem of inequality in the world.
It was not by accident that nations failed, but purposely by the elite in power. Although technology is now being embraced by the Indians, there is still a superior use of the labor force.
what makes a country move forward or any state is human resource capital. Anywhere in the world, it's human resource. Where are your innovations and great thinkers going to come? 60% of your people are tilling the land.
The fear of integrating new technologies in these societies is the fear by those in power of creative destruction. The new technologies will render the old system obsolete, and in turn render the elites that are in control of it obsolete. For a system to generate free markets and opportunities for creative destruction, power needs to be divided into the hands of many. The existing oligarchy must suffer a devastating event, and the elites must lose control of the governing forces. The point in time at which this opportunity arises is referred to by the authors as a critical juncture.
So the way that we describe critical junctures in the book is that there are periods during which existing institutions can no longer be maintained in their current way. And so that generates a sort of window of opportunity for change. It ranges from many things. It could be created by outside events. Those are the simplest ones. The Black Death, decimating the population of Europe and parts of Asia. International war. New technologies completely destabilizing the situation. But, it could also be, in many countries, the death of a leader or emergence of some new coalitions or a shock like COVID-19. So there are many of them, but they are still somewhat rare. It's not something that happens every year. And that's why when a critical juncture occurs, it is also an opportunity for those who could form a coalition or a movement or a political party to push for something better to take advantage of, because they're not going to occur every time.
The example they describe as the greatest critical juncture bringing about the first sustainable economy is the Glorious Revolution in Britain, 1688. The revolution would deteriorate the power of the monarchy and give power to Parliament and into the hands of the people. But in order for that scenario to take place, the monarchy had to already be weak. The genesis of that weakness was the second pandemic of the bubonic plague in the mid-14th century. It killed nearly half the population of Eurasia, with episodes in England lasting up until the late 17th century. As the plague devastated England and the resources of the monarchy depleted, Parliament began to organize and strengthen. Then, in the mid-17th century, Oliver Cromwell, backed by Parliament, overthrew and executed King Charles. He served as Lord Protector until his death, over which period Parliament became even more powerful and influential. When the monarchy was restored, Parliament called upon William of Orange to overthrow the monarchy once again, and a new constitution was established. The freedom of the people evolved to the point where most members of society had the opportunity for progress. Technology, education, and transportation began to advance at a rapid pace, paving the way for the Industrial Revolution. Creating a prosperous society with the most equal distribution of wealth and power in history. Everywhere where this model of society was replicated, those countries flourished with similar prosperity. Everyone else was left behind. Most were left behind. With an intentionally organized, unbalanced social structure that was put in place thousands of years ago, the exposure that England brought to India brought with it different consequences. According to the authors, there are two types of institutions that allow either a country to be prosperous or for its economy to stagnate, and the vast majority of its people to live in poverty. The institutions that ensure poverty are extractive institutions. Those that promote prosperity, inclusive institutions. And if there is one word which presents a solution to the myriad of challenges to the poor in all circumstances which will be addressed throughout this film, it is this word: inclusive. An extractive institution would be run by the rule of a small elite group, an absolutist regime. The majority of the members of this system are coerced to serve the state. Secure private property rights almost never exist in this environment. This includes land, branding, and ideas, and inventions protected by legal documents such as patents and copyrights. In an extractive institution, property is either owned by the state, in modern times such as North Korea or the Soviet Union, or by a small wealthy elite such as the apartheid regime in South Africa. Education is usually limited to a small group. Another key factor is the absence of free media. If people are well educated in an instance like North Korea or China or the Soviet Union, the people are limited in the knowledge they are allowed to obtain. From what is seen on the television and film, books, and the internet, everything is controlled. The more limited the individual is in a society and the less opportunity each and every individual has for prosperity, the poorer the country tends to be. Making those countries in which slavery has been a predominant presence in the population the poorest.
Of course, then they might find a way of justifying that through some ideological garb. But how else would you understand slavery? Sure, some slave owners in the US South before Civil War would tell you they were doing this for the good of the slaves, but slavery was ultimately about exploitation. And if you think that slavery was a historical anachronism, far from it. It is just one version of the same thing that has happened throughout history and even today. I mean, until it collapsed in 1994, the South African apartheid regime had much in common with slavery. It had, again, that had disappeared even before then, 1994, but it had a color bar that meant that black South Africans, more than 80% of the population, could not work in anything other than the most unskilled occupations. They could not become supervisors, they could not become carpenters, machinists, clerks, accountants, anything that really would give them an opportunity for social mobility. They were repressed, they were excluded, and this was not poverty of a huge population of South Africa that was created by mistake, but it was created by design. If you go to Egypt, if you go to North Korea, if you go to parts of Latin America, you see different versions of the same story, but it has much in common, and that's really what we had to understand, and that's why a lot of the arguments in the book are about the politics of poverty, because who controls political power, what they do with that political power, for whose benefits and at whose expense. Those are the critical things we discuss.
The results of all these oppressive elements are intentional. It is the elite's fear of losing power to the possibility of creative destruction. Technology and advancement become a threat to the elites, so as they maintain their wealth, the people and the nation as a whole are left behind. The continuous cycle of this throughout time is what the authors refer to as the vicious circle. But there is also a virtuous circle.
What we define as inclusive institutions is an ideal type. is an ideal that no country ever has achieved. When we give examples of inclusive institutions, those are never perfect. That has to be borne in mind. But really, you should think of inclusive institutions in 3 layers. The first is economic, and that's very simple. We can talk about the details, but the big picture is clear. We define inclusive institutions as those that create opportunities and incentives for the people, not just for a few scions of the richest families, monarchs or dukes, not just for the cousins of the dictator or the military junta, but for the broad population. Opportunities, that's what we miss most of history. If you go back to South Africa under apartheid, that's an extreme case of no opportunities for 85% of the population. But if you go to US South, well after slavery had disappeared in the 1940s, 1950s, there are no opportunities for black Americans, and there are not even that many opportunities for white low-income Americans. So those opportunities have to be there. But then also you need the incentives that people actually grab those opportunities. So if you provide everybody good schooling, but then you don't give them any incentives because they can't succeed in business, they can't succeed in professions, they cannot succeed as workers, that's not going to work either. So those incentives and opportunities, they need to be at the heart of the economic system. And then we go through what are the things that would actually be best for generating such things. The market economy is key, not an unfettered market without any regulation, but what we call an inclusive market, a market built on public services, public education, regulation of monopoly so that there isn't a power imbalance. But those sorts of market institutions are still key because the alternative to markets is central planning, and that's not going to create opportunities or incentives in any appreciable form. Then you need that inclusive economic institutions to be embedded in inclusive political institutions. One needs to make sure that the other exists. One needs to be there in order to be the basis of the other, whether that they are in positive synergy. And inclusive political institutions really are about the political analog of the same economic principle. The inclusive institutions fail when opportunities are monopolized, when money is monopolized by some groups. And political inclusivity fails when political power is monopolized by some groups. So that's why it's critical to have some sort of democratic institutions. It's critical to have some sort of checks and balances or constitutional rules so that whoever gets elected doesn't misbehave. That's why it's critical to have some state capacity, that the state is capable of regulating, enforcing law and order, and all of these things. But the third layer is really at the root of this, and that's really, we talked on this a little bit in Why Nations Fail, but it's the topic of our more recent book, The Narrow Corridor, that James and I wrote last year. And you really need political mobilization of the masses, that people need to be engaged in politics. They need to be part of the political machinery. They don't need to, they shouldn't just let politicians or elites or the learned ones to rule the country. So that sort of political engagement of the people is an important safeguard of these inclusive political institutions.
There is one creation that we have developed in the industrialized world in which it doesn't matter whether it is a rich nation or poor. There will always be a vast number of challenges and complications. And this is the megacity. As of 2018, depending on who is doing the assessment, there's somewhere in between 30 to as many as 50 of these cities worldwide, most of which belong to Asia, with India and China ranking at the top of the list. The United States is home to 2. New York, which was actually the first in the world to cross the 10 million mark in the 1930s. And Los Angeles. there are similar challenges that these metropolitan behemoths have to face. Although all of the challenges are present in each of these urban environments, when you get into the newly industrialized world, the challenges are massively amplified. For instance, almost never in the West would you see smoke as the environment. In Mumbai, it's a daily occurrence. Poor air quality is just one of the obstacles. Other common aspects of these highly populated metro regions are sanitation, slums, more often seen in the developing nations, overpopulation, gentrification, urban sprawls, high traffic and population density, and an abnormally high homeless population. Mumbai is not the largest city in India, but it is the wealthiest. The cost of real estate here would be unaffordable for the majority of inhabitants in the developed world. Given that the GDP of the nation is a nominal $1,500 per head, the cost of real estate for the majority of Mumbaikars is unimaginable. Because of this dramatic wealth disparity, the singular aspect of this city impossible to overlook is its slum population. As you look over the city in a bird's eye view, most of what you'll see will be makeshift housing. It's difficult to conceive of anything like this in the United States, but it was only 80 years ago, when our economy was in stagnation, that we had Hoovervilles. The stigma that is often seen for those experiencing homelessness in the United States is not the same as those which compose the slum population in Mumbai.
The first things first, we must understand the distinction in the West there has to be is between slum and homeless. In the Western mind, this is a grey area, or maybe not a grey area. They consider the people in the slum to be homeless. This is not true. Most of the people living in slums are gainfully employed.
These aren't folks that society has cast aside and forgotten about. It's the majority of the community, estimated to be somewhere around 60%.
The reason they are in that slum is one reason, is that unfortunately the jobs in India are, I won't say limited, but by and large in a greater number in the metro cities. They are all flocking here because this is where their jobs are. The person has to stay somewhere close to his work. This is where these little shanties and slums start mushrooming.
Yeah, I think if you look at India, there's almost 74 million people do not have access to affordable shelter. That's a huge call, for the government. I think so I think government has a very important role to play. I think the new government is talking about housing for all by 2022.
For all?
For all. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I think it's an ambitious vision or target.
So when they say housing for everybody in 8 years, they mean they think they're going to get rid of the slums in 8 years?
Well, either they get rid of the slums or they provide accommodation to these people. When we need to look at high-rise buildings, like I think what I've learned living in Manila is that socialized housing is clearly defined by the Philippines government, and then they are talking about 800,000 people who do not have access to shelter. So I think they are also looking at high-rise building in urban areas. Yeah, I think we need to look at high-rise building, and we need to look at infrastructure. We need to look at livelihood. We need to look at the social structure, and I think we need to have a holistic approach in terms of dealing with housing in urban setup.
In previous decades, building restrictions were a major issue. Over the years, Mumbai has become more and more vertical, increasing its walkability and gradually beginning to bring stability to the housing markets. Programs in the ilk of inclusionary zoning have been adopted. For example, when a builder wants to erect a housing structure where a slum is currently standing, he must first build a structure for the inhabitants of the slum before building his desired edifice. The building is marked with this symbol here to indicate this sort of housing arrangement. There is a lot to learn from these practices, especially when it comes to building vertically, because if there is one issue that Los Angeles suffers in respect to common symptoms of megacities, it is the urban sprawl. Quite possibly the largest, most complicated on the planet. Just think of the landmass in comparison to other cities. You could take New York City and put it inside a municipal Los Angeles, and then add San Francisco and Boston and St. Louis, and you'd still have 37 square miles left over. In the metropolitan region, you could fit 4 Rhode Islands. The sprawl of metropolitan Los Angeles is really a societal preference. It's an overpopulated megacity that desperately wants to remain a small town, making its failure to urbanize more of a cultural issue protected by excessive regulation with a not-in-my-backyard mentality. Mumbai seems to have learned this lesson and appears to be taking more action in the matter. But housing aside, what's really the greatest threat that a country suffering from extreme poverty faces? In some cases, it's starvation. That's less of an issue in urban areas of India. The most pressing issue is sanitation. It's so critical that even programs like Habitat for Humanity India have started to move more towards this matter than housing alone. The United Nations Population Division estimated that in 2015, on average, 156,000 people died every day, 57 million people for the year. In 2018, the WHO estimated that the number of deaths of children 5 years and younger was 5.4 million, almost 10% of the whole figure. Impoverished countries see the brunt of these numbers. Pneumonia, malaria, and diarrhea-related diseases like rotavirus, dysentery, and cholera are the main causes. The CDC estimated that 2,195 children 5 years and younger die every day from diarrhea-related diseases alone. And 88% of the time it is due to unsafe water and inadequate sanitation and hygiene. For this reason, it should be evident that extreme poverty is by far the world's biggest killer. The challenges here are on a massive scale. We must keep in mind India, the megacities, and the immense population. The architecture of her society is social imbalance. The rich are very rich, the poor are very poor, and for the most part it's been accepted by everyone on every level. They're used to it. Unraveling this structure is an evolutionary process that'll take generations to come. It would be easier to start from scratch since it takes so much undoing. The majority of the population seems to have given up on the idea of some sort of egalitarian possibility, and the 3 million plus non-governmental organizations throughout the country focus on the critical issues of general welfare. In respect to India of eventually obtaining a more equal society, the number one tool to accomplish this feat is the great equalizer, education. The other two main factors in the battle that the Indians face in providing living standards that will protect its at-risk inhabitants from the deadly elements of extreme poverty are, as already mentioned, sanitation, and perhaps less discernible for some, transportation.
I think rural area is not an issue because the land is available and people own the land, and there's agriculture. So I think they are able to supplement their income. But in urban areas, if you're really talking about providing shelter to people living in urban slums, I think we need to look at infrastructure. I think which includes water, sanitation, and electricity. And second thing is livelihood. If you're going to relocate people from maybe the Arabi slums to another area. So I think we are uprooting the whole community. I think livelihood is very important because they have, their livelihood, their social structure is already built there. So if you're really looking at relocation, I think we need to build on the infrastructure and the livelihood, the social structure before we can relocate the people.
So what happens is that 200 kilometers away, if somebody had to come for 200 kilometers away, it would take them upwards of 6 hours today. It's impossible.
In the present conditions.
In the present conditions. So if he has to get to work at 8 a.m., now he's going to have to leave his house at 2 a.m. Mm-hmm. And so this is just not possible. Mm-hmm. The problem here is because there is no quick transportation. The reason that gentleman or that family is living in that slum is that so he can be in and around the work area. Say he could on the outskirts of the city, which is say maybe hundreds of kilometers, and there's a high-speed train which could get you maybe within an hour, like from 200, like going at about 150 kilometers an hour, 200 kilometers an hour. You can come into the city. Then if you actually go and see the prices, 200 kilometers away from Mumbai, they're reasonably affordable.
Up until fairly recently, this factor of infrastructure was neither a concern nor a reality. There were disconnected villages and densely populated cities and nothing in between. Suburbia didn't really exist. It's probably the leading cause of the size of the slums, and increased efficient mobility would be their most effective solution.
People would then move out there, probably move out of the slums and say, okay, buy a small place here because it's 200 kilometers away, but I can hop on this train and I'm there to work in an hour, hour and a half. So if I leave it, and I can go back there. A community will form over there, will kind of form itself over there. These guys are obviously going to need stuff. Then the grocery store will come and they will end up spending money out there also because they're going to have to eat. So then things will start mushrooming and that entire area will develop.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we just launched is Sensitize to Sanitize campaign. It's basically to deal with sanitation. Yeah,
it's a big issue.
Big issue. We have 600 million people who practice open defecation in India. 600 million, highest in the world.
Describe day one of the...
Day one, you want me to describe day one?
Yeah.
David is a filmmaker from Los Angeles. He is doing a movie about two cities, Los Angeles and Mumbai. He wants me to answer what was day one on the beach. Let me go back. It was over a second, a year back. And I was contemplating, I moved in this area 6 months before. मेरे balcony से समुद्र दिखता है पूरा प्लास्टिक दिखता था और कोई लोग दिखते नहीं थे, ना कोई वॉक करने आता है ना कोई स्विम करने आता है। और जब मैं सुबह बीच पे जाता था मैं बोला आई थॉट टू माई सेल्फ आई शुड गो देयर एंड सी क्या है। आप अगर सुबह जाएंगे 6 बजे से 10 बजे के बीच में सब टॉयलेट्स करते हैं लेफ्ट राइट सेंटर। तो एक तो साइड रिपल्सिव होती है। डेविड व्हाट आई एम ट्राइंग टू टेल इज ओपन डिफेकेशन इज अ बिग प्रॉब्लम देयर ऑन द बीच। So I decided that I will, मैं लॉयर था तो कई लोगों ने बोला हाई कोर्ट में पिटिशन दाखिल करो, पब्लिक इंटरेस्ट लिटिगेशन बोलते हैं, और चीफ जस्टिस को बोलो ये कुछ करो इसके लिए। चीफ मिनिस्टर नहीं करता तो चीफ जस्टिस करेगा, जुडिशरी करेंगे। इसके बारे में मैंने बहुत सोचा, फिर मैंने सोचा आई टेक अ हार्ड वे, थोड़ा टफ वे, एंड व्हाट डेविड इज आस्किंग इज ट्रू, इट इज अ टफ वे। I asked myself, yes I know something is wrong, what can I do to rectify it? अब मैं क्या करूं इसको सुधारने के लिए? मैं अकेला आदमी हूं, मैं क्या कर सकता हूं? मैं ग्लव्स पहन के प्लास्टिक उठा सकता हूं, इससे ज्यादा मैं क्या कर सकता हूं? तो मैं बीच में गया और 84-year-old मेरे साथ गए। हमने पहले दिन में 5 बैग भर के प्लास्टिक निकाला, बहुत खुश हो गए। मेरे को पता नहीं था कि ये जेटी साइड और इतना बड़ा प्लास्टिक का 5-5 फुट का वो है। We picked up 5 bags and we were very happy. So that was my first day.
It's difficult to find a more inspiring story of community volunteerism than Afroz Shah. It's not the frequency of his engagement, but the persistence of it that's important, and his ability to raise awareness, particularly in the young.
Let me see.
Yeah, you have to click it. Save the beach, he says.
Getting families involved and speaking at local schools in the hopes of replicating his model of success.
They're hard workers.
In 2015, he and a friend walking the beach of Versova, picking up trash by hand, eventually transpired into the largest beach cleanup in world history. 1 year later, the United Nations named him a champion of the earth, inspiring their environmental program to launch the Clean Seas campaign globally. As of August 29, 2021, he has spent every weekend for the past 323 dedicating his time to sanitation and plastic removal from Mumbai's rivers and ocean shore.
Though लोग थे, we didn't ever think where it will go, how it will go. I didn't know. Yesterday there were around 1,300 people on the beach. 1,300 people on the beach cleaning the beach, which is quite commendable.
I'm of the belief that not just education and not just informal education, but formal education is extremely important. Just when we are poised to become the youngest country as in country with the maximum number of young people in the world, we definitely need our young adolescents. We definitely need to invest money, resources, everything in this young population, because they're going to be the tomorrow of India. And the world, because they are going to be the maximum number of people. So there's a lot of investment that needs to happen with this, and education is a means to do human development. It is one of the basic steps to move towards human development. That's the foundation to have good responsible citizens. I mean, it's not in education just doesn't give academics, but it definitely does a lot with other aspects of development, which is discipline, which is respect for your own things, and that is what it should be do. And that's the reason why I'm of the firm belief that this can happen in a formal schooling system where there is a discipline, where there is an assembly, where they can inculcate all the values which they need to know at that foundation level.
Formal education is essential to the wealth of a nation. In fact, just literacy alone shows remarkable improvement. Look at China by comparison, the only other country that deals with the same circumstance of overpopulation. India's current literacy rate is 74%, which, to be fair, is a vast improvement from 20% before their independence in 1947. China, whose economy is almost 6 times the size in nominal figures, has a literacy rate of 97%. Another advantage, and one of the few inclusive programs of the CCP, was to impose compulsory teaching of Mandarin in all schools, unifying the country with one language. By comparison, 121 languages are spoken by at least 10,000 or more Indian citizens. The 57% fluent in Hindi have a far greater advantage, and the 10% that speak English as a second language have an even greater advantage.
The idea is that if they come out with a good level of education, they would, when they go into the world, into the job market, they would secure a job better than his or her, their parent, and maybe their child would secure a better, and maybe in 2 generations you would see a tectonic shift in their standing.
They've missed out, especially these night school students have missed out a lot of things because they're dropouts. Most of them are dropouts. Mm-hmm. And it's important that this foundation needs to be built through education, through a good quality education, so that when they step out, ready to kind of face the world, take on more responsibilities, they will not only contribute to the nation building, but also contribute to their own growth and progress. So education can do a lot. It's very important. Once you invest, make right kind of investments, and if we spend the right kind of things and we are able to kind of crack that, then I think the rest of the problems that we have in today's world and today's India will not be there.
On a micro level, I think that if everybody does that, in India at least, I think we could see some reasonable results.
It's a multi-layered issue, and we can't group the homeless into one, into sort of one container and say, this is the homeless, and therefore we're going to apply one solution to all of them.
LA County's one solution is to attempt to build enough structures to shelter those without shelter.
Most programs, like you build a prison, that's not intended to give back to the community. That's intended to be out of sight, away from the community. You build a large mental hospital. That's not intended to get you back in the community. It's intended to stay out of sight. You build a board and care. You build a homeless assistance program. And as long as you're stuck in the middle of this river, everyone's just getting bashed and there's no chance for anybody to get recovered, and the whole thing just gets overwhelmed, and then everyone loses their humanity.
Everything's moving out toward what they call housing first. Which is, hey, all homeless people need is a house. So let me tell you how that has worked out on a micro level. I get calls monthly from affordable housing providers who say, hey, we're a mixed use building, so that means they have low income people and they have formerly homeless people. The low income people do great, but a lot of the folks that were chronically homeless that come in, they're either sleeping in the courtyard in their tent, or they've been ripped out of the community and away from the friends the only friends that they had, so they're back on the streets. I've had people who are suicidal because they're in this stark white apartment and it's too kind of nice and they feel the pressure of trying to keep it up. They've never had to do that before. So it's not as easy as just saying, if we just transport people into four walls, we'll solve homelessness.
Right.
Too much regulation is an obstacle here as well. As with any economically robust city, jobs continuously move in, far outpacing the growth of real estate. This, coupled with constant subsidies for affordable housing without an equal increase in supply, continuously forces the prices up. We've created a scenario now where there's a massive increase in people and money, but a lack of building. Adding to the money supply just seems to make things less affordable. Housing is just one obstacle. To pool all resources into this alone is applying a macro solution to a broad array of micro scenarios. The issues of disenfranchised individuals throughout a developed city need to be dealt with case by case, and the solutions for the struggles of one individual are much different from that of another.
You have homeless youth, you have homeless families, you have homeless single dads, homeless single moms, you have the chronically, ill, you have the chronically mentally ill. There's a whole, just as they're, my next door neighbors, just because they live in my neighborhood, they're nothing like me.
I live in a tent and it's not a home.
Anytime that there's a complicated issue and anyone says there's one solution, I start getting a little worried, a lot worried.
Proclaiming you can solve homelessness in 10 years with housing alone is like saying you're going to solve obesity in 10 years with gym memberships for everyone that's overweight, or we can solve the healthcare crisis in 10 years, or the opioid crisis, or domestic abuse. All consumer protection issues will disappear in 10 years, and we can solve all mental health issues. It's almost like saying you can solve the game of chess with a fixed number of moves. Now, like solving the homeless crisis, this would work too, if every opponent you ever played made the exact move you need them to make at every single turn, at every single game.
What you have to do is take it down on this real micro level. So let's just take one homeless person. Let's just say with one homeless person that we pour a ton of resources into that one person. Will their problems be fixed? Not necessarily. Depends on the problem.
Think of it like a broken dam that is flooding a town. To focus all your energy on housing and very little toward the circumstances that put individuals in a state of chronic homelessness would be like constantly pumping the water out of the town with minimal effort to fix the dam. Now, an evenly distributed amount of energy in both projects, fixing the dam and pumping the water, would be useful. But if you could only pick one, would the best solution be to continuously pump water out of the areas that are flooded? Or would it be better to direct all your effort toward repairing the dam?
We need to save people who are drowning in the river, and we need to find out why they're getting in the river in the first place. Sometimes they're being pushed in, sometimes they're jumping in, sometimes they slipped and fell in the river. It doesn't matter to me why they're in the river. I just want to know why they're in the river. And I want to go upstream and go, listen, let's take care of whatever's getting you to this place. And I think we need to stop judging why they get in the river.
Right.
Doesn't matter.
Right.
We've all made mistakes. Some of us end up in the drowning in the river, and some of us don't. And that's again where that compassion piece comes in.
But one of the problems with policies is they have unintended side effects. Similar example, Social Security. There's different rates for where you're living. So if you live somewhere, you get into California $860 a month. If you're on the streets, you get $980 because it costs more to live on the streets. You can't cook and stuff. If you have no kitchen, you get a little more. Therefore, if you're sitting on the streets, homeless, and getting your 980 check, and you're ready to move into an apartment, the first thing that happens is we lower your check by $120 as a punishment for moving into your own place.
De-incentivizing.
Right, that wasn't the intention, of course. So policies you have to watch out for where the intention is often a quite good thing, but when you're at that macro level, rather than helping one person at a time, there's likely to be, the higher up you go, the more unintended side effects or unintended bad things that happen that you never considered at all.
So we're a program. We're not a retreat center. We're not a hotel. We don't have apartments here. We have a program. And when families say, hey, we're just frustrated because we want more space, we go, exactly. And that's why you're saving your money, and that's why you're working so hard, so you can get your own apartment. So.
And there is a term here.
There is.
And it's...
Yeah, I mean, right now at our current shelter, it's 90 to 120 days.
Okay.
Here it will be probably 9 to 10 months.
9 to 10 months?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And it really depends on, again, part of our accountability is, are you making progress? And it can be an inch of progress, or it can be a foot, or it can be a mile. But if you're stagnant or you're moving backwards, then that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Then we need to figure out what's either keeping you stuck or keeping you from moving forward. And again, that's what our staff does, is identify the barriers and help people overcome them.
The case-by-case scenarios fueling the homeless crisis in Los Angeles are spawned from a plethora of causes. Even the most experienced boots-on-the-ground outreach worker will find new categories every year. Of course, they don't usually come as a single cause, but as clusters of issues. The few we'll be focusing on are probably the most critical and tend to create or exacerbate the rest. The first of which sounds to many like putting out fire with fire.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with the bipartisan leaders, which began at 8 o'clock and was completed 2 hours later. I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive dealing with the problems of sources of supply as well as Americans who may be stationed abroad wherever they are in the world. It will be government-wide, pulling together the 9 different fragmented areas within the government in which this problem is now being handled. And it will be nationwide in terms of a new educational program that we trust will result from the discussions that we have had.
From our nation's capital, welcome to America's Drug Forum. I'm Randy Page. We depart today from our normal format to take the opportunity to speak at length with one of the nation's most influential thinkers of the 20th century, Professor Milton Friedman. Professor Friedman was the 1976 Nobel Prize recipient for economic science. He's a former economic advisor to President Ronald Reagan, and among his many lists of accomplishments, most recently he is the recipient of the 1991 Richard Dennis Drug Peace Award for his consistent and controversial call for drug policy reform. Professor Friedman, thanks for being with us today.
Glad to be with you.
Let us deal first with the issue of legalization of drugs. How do you see America changing for the better under that system?
I see America with half the number of prisons, half the number of prisoners, 10,000 fewer homicides a year, inner cities in which there's a chance for these poor people to live without being afraid for their lives, respectable citizens who are now, citizens who might be respectable who are now addicts, not being subject to becoming criminals in order to get their drug, being able to get drugs for which they're sure of the quality. You know, the same thing happened under prohibition of alcohol as is happening now. Under prohibition of alcohol, deaths from alcohol poisoning, from poisoning by things that were mixed in with the alcohol, the illegal bootleg alcohol, went up sharply. Similarly, under drug prohibition, deaths from overdose, from adulterations, from adulterated substances have gone up.
Milton Friedman noted that the two most violent periods of the 20th century, when homicides were at their peak, had a direct correlation between law enforcement and drugs. The first was the prohibition of alcohol.
Uh-oh! There'll be no more scenes such as this. Barrel after barrel of prize whiskeys destroyed by government agents. It's gonna be a cold winter for the barrel busters.
The second began in the early 70s. It's no coincidence that 3 years after Richard Nixon declares the war on drugs, that Pablo Escobar begins to develop his cartel, which eventually turns him into one of the richest men alive at the time. Without this program, his venture never would have been possible. It paved the way. In fact, it would be fitting to call the war on drugs a critical juncture for a criminal empire.
A group of cities have set up the European Cities on Drug Policy. And what they say is, our national governments hold us down. We in the cities face the problem, and we must come up with different approaches.
Not only has prohibition plagued many of the modern American cities with violence, but it has probably been the cause of drugs becoming stronger, more addicting, and more deadly. The theory behind this effect is called the iron law of prohibition, a phrase first used by economist Richard Cowan in his 1986 essay, How the Narcs Created Crack, in which his conclusion is drawn that the harder the law enforcement, the harder the drug. The harder the law enforcement, the harder the drug. The inherent risk in the business of illegal drugs comes in two major categories: storage of the product and transportation of the product. When these are your greatest risks, the best method of maximizing your profit is to make the product smaller and stronger. Each shipment generates more revenue, and the product is now something that the consumer can develop physical dependency for, generating greater demand and allowing the supplier to charge an exorbitant premium. We've seen evidence of this throughout history. How, for instance, coca, an ingredient which used to be found in Coca-Cola, turned into cocaine. And laudanum, commonly found in most pharmacies, evolved into heroin, one of our most destructive and dangerous illegal opioids today. The greater the risk, the stronger the drug, the lower the supply, the higher the demand.
We are clinging on to prohibition and the war on drugs as if they were giant security blankets and that we couldn't live without them. I think we could live without them very well and control drug abuse and control crime much better by new approaches.
But where is the relevance of any of this in respect to the major components contributing to the homeless crisis in our urban environments? Well, as it turns out, prohibition may be the most detrimental piece of legislation affecting more components to the crisis than any other aspect.
I'm also proposing that we enlarge our criminal justice system across the board, at the local, state, and federal levels alike. We need more prisons, more jails, more courts, more prosecutors.
You know, I've been in Skid Row for 2 years now, and I've learned a lot about the people here in Skid Row. I now call them my brothers and my sisters. We're people. Yes. I ask every Every day I question in my head, why? Why are there so many black folks living in Skid Row? Why? As Pastor Q said the other day, it's just another reservation that we've been exiled to.
In consideration to race, the largest group of the homeless population in Los Angeles is black. It is also the greatest overrepresentation of a race. The percentage of black citizens in LA is actually lower than the national average of 13%. LA County is 9%, however they account for over 40% of the homeless population of the county. Black men are most susceptible to being victims of one of our country's most evil institutions since slavery.
We need more prisons, more jails, more courts, more prosecutors.
Is that proper? I think it's absolutely disgraceful that our government, supposed to be our government, should be in the position of converting people who are not harming others into criminals, of destroying their life, putting them in jail. I don't see, that's the issue to me. The economic issue is strict. The economic issue comes in only for explaining why it has those effects. But the economic reasons are not the reasons. Of course we're wasting money on it.
There are
10,
many...
$20, $30 billion a year.
Show me what a police state looks like! This is what a police state looks like! Show me what a police state looks like! This is what a police state looks like! Show me what a police state looks like! This is what a police state looks like! Show me what a police state looks like! This is what a police state looks like! Show me what a police state looks like! This is what a police state looks like!
It is most often the case that a black male in particular goes to jail for several years for violating a law that should never have existed in the first place. When they get out, they have no skills or motivation and a felony on their record, making employment next to impossible. As if employment wasn't difficult enough to begin with for their demographic. Racial discrimination in respect to entry-level employment was well demonstrated in a study conducted by Dava Pager in her book Marked: Race, Crime, and Finding a Work in an Era of Mass Incarceration. The study went like this. There were two groups of men, one white and one black in each group. They were the same age and shared a similar appearance, education, and overall presentation of themselves. These men went throughout the Milwaukee metro region in search of an entry-level job. In the first group, the white man had no criminal record and the black man put a bogus felony conviction relating to drugs, not violence, on his resume. In the second group, the opposite was true. Now, obviously, the felon had a more difficult time getting a job, but only in comparison to his counterpart of color. It turned out that the white felon actually got more callbacks than the black non-offender. It's going to take a great deal of time and energy for social phenomenon such as this to phase out of our culture. The war on drugs is a serious burden, slowing down the advancement of that process. And oftentimes, this is where these men end up. And just as well, they may have left behind a broken home, a situation all too common, which just invites an opportunity for the cycle to continue.
The police in our neighborhood deal with that high state of tension, on a daily basis. I doubt that there's a more qualified and trained mental illness group of police officers in the city of Los Angeles than down in Skid Row.
Anywhere in the world, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
Another unforgivable side effect of this program is that instead of going after the counterproductive legislation and the prison system, the community blames the front line, who have no power in the decision-making process. It's almost as if they are a shield that the cowardly lawmakers use to deflect all the accountability. A drive to end prohibition should not fuel the mentality that law enforcement is pure evil and a blight on the homeless community. They are an essential link in the chain of rehabilitation when properly utilized. Solutions like this are far from the answer. This would be more realistic. Los Angeles should have more police, less of a need for them, and a much smaller prison population. Criminalizing drugs can make the police a problem, but it gives them a problem they shouldn't have to deal with, and in effect, prevents them from doing their real job. If the system were rewired to function ethically and efficiently, the job of a police officer would be extremely boring.
There used to be something down here called a special prosecutor. And what special prosecutors did were able to know the area intimately. So they could help identify which cases were warranted more attention in the court. So a person that is a known user, low money guy, that's constantly going in and out, and gets a lot of focus, as opposed to the one guy that's actually doing the drug dealing and keeps slipping through. Special prosecutors, knowing the neighborhood intimately, working hand in hand with the police department, used to target, the drug dealer, the predator, in a way that you take away that predator, and a lot of the behavior, will dissipate. Right? You don't have those guys taking advantage of the population, and for whatever reasons, those don't exist in Skid Row and in other neighborhoods anymore either. So it's that type of tool, that could allow law enforcement more power to police that type of drug activity, which would then help us. It's kind of hard to have a recovery zone down here, in and around the missions, people trying to get well, people trying to, whatever that is, and then go right out on the sidewalk and have, the option to go drink and use again.
It's a moral problem. It's a problem of the harm which government is doing. Look, I have estimated statistically that the prohibition of drugs produces, on the average, 10,000 additional homicides a year. It's a moral problem that the government is going around killing 10,000 people. It's a moral problem that the government is making into criminals people who may be doing something you and I don't approve of, but who are doing something that hurts nobody else. Most of the arrests for drugs are for possession by casual users.
Skid Row is one neighborhood, if you will, in Los Angeles where the gangs cooperate. There's no turf war in Skid Row. Equal opportunity. Bloods and Crips, side by side, corner to corner, do not argue about turf in Skid Row. It's equal opportunity. You want to know who the drug dealers are, you go stand on the corner for 20, 30 minutes and the best dressed guys out there. They're here all the time.
The end of prohibition could be the most effective tool of removing the predators from an environment where those suffering from drug addiction are supposed to be seeking rehabilitation. And of those that are of the greatest risk are those whose substance abuse disorders are comorbid with one of the severe mental health illnesses.
The proper role of government is to prevent other people from harming an individual. Government, he said, never has any right to interfere with an individual for that individual's own good. Look, if you really... The case for prohibiting drugs is exactly as strong and as weak as a case for prohibiting people from overeating. We all know that overeating causes more deaths than drugs do. Why isn't it perfect if it's in principle okay for the government to say you must not consume drugs because they do you harm? Why isn't it all right to say you must not eat too much because you do harm? Why isn't it all right to say you must not try to go in for skydiving because you're likely to die? Why isn't it all right to say, oh, skiing, that's no good, that's a very dangerous sport, you'll hurt yourself? Where do you draw the line?
Where this argument often gets distorted by critics is when they try to impose a straw man attack on its proponents. The presumption is, so what you're trying to tell us is that drugs are good for you. Of course they aren't. Recreational drugs, for the most part, are horrible. They can devastate lives, crippling those around them, and cause a huge burden for their families and loved ones. The same is true with alcoholism. or the health issues that can be a byproduct of morbid obesity from an addiction to high fructose corn syrup, such as type 2 diabetes, claiming over 450 million victims worldwide since 1980. The claim has nothing to do with whether or not drugs are good. The claim is that prohibition has zero positive effects and a whole host of devastating ones. Just the fact that it provides the greatest source of power to organized criminals should be enough to take it off the books. But it also perpetuates poverty and exclusion from society for the disenfranchised because it makes the criminal option temporarily more profitable than the educated or skilled service.
The role of the government is to protect the drug cartel. That's literally true.
Is it doing a good job with it?
Excellent. What do I mean by that? In an ordinary free market business, let's take potatoes, beef, anything you want. There are thousands of importers and exporters. Anybody can go into the business. But it's very hard for a small person to go into the drug importing business because our interdiction efforts essentially make it enormously costly. So the only people who can survive in that business are these large meddling cartel kind of people who have enough money so they can have fleets of airplanes, so they can have sophisticated methods, so on. So in effect, in addition to which, by keeping goods out, by arresting, let's say, local marijuana growers, the government keeps the price of these products high. So what more could a monopolist want? He's got a government who makes it very hard for all his competitors, and who keeps the price of his product high. It's absolutely heaven.
I would hardly say to anyone in law enforcement that they've been a wild success in terms of controlling cocaine or any of the drugs. They've just got to face the fact that what they're doing, while well-intentioned, doesn't work.
At the local, state, and federal levels alike.
The worst of these unintended consequences are the acts committed against impoverished families.
What we know is when a child ages out of care, their likelihood of negative consequences, long-term negative consequences, increases significantly. Homelessness, unemployment, early parenting, substance abuse, not because they're bad kids. Again, we don't want to play into the misperceptions that too old, too dangerous, they've been in the foster care system. Rather, they don't have the safety net of a family. They're not allowed to make a mistake. They're not allowed to stumble. They get caught into systems immediately rather than having arms wrapped around them and guide them along the way.
Aging out of foster care is the greatest source of the flood. Unfortunately, few seem to realize this. Whatever the scenario may be, once a child is separated from its parents, justifiably or not, they are introduced to a long series of strangers. From a social worker, to a foster home, to a lawyer, maybe a different social worker, to a judge, to a new foster home, then perhaps another, to finally an adoption. At which point the child's birth mother might struggle back and forth with the child's new parents for custody, or perhaps partial custody. The child may return to the parent or parents from which they were taken. Maybe they were taken unjustifiably. In some cases, the parents actually were abusive to the point where the government was right to have intervened in the first place. Or maybe there was a change of heart and the child is abandoned. And then the process happens all over again. It must be hard for a young person who is continuously passed around in this chain of strangers not to think nobody wants you. And if there is one weak link in this chain, the opportunities the child has also weaken immensely. And the longer the chain, the lower the chances of success. In some circumstances, there is an individual which oversees this entire process. That person is called a CASA, a court-appointed special advocate. All of these individuals the child encounters have several cases to manage. The CASA usually has one child to look after and acts as the connective tissue through this long series of events. And if there is one weak link somewhere in the chain, they often have the tools to fix it.
Experience of growing up, it's very hard to imagine a child who has nobody. And in this system where children are separated from their families and when circumstances don't allow them to return to their family, these kids really are alone. And, you know, they're vulnerable to all kinds of predators and people who take advantage of them, but they also just don't have that sense of security or solidity of anybody supporting who you are as a person. And I think that CASAs often find themselves, particularly with older children, in the role of just being that for them.
If you ask most people, what's a homeless person? And I do ask that question quite a bit.
Really?
I'll hear the same things over and over again. Old white guy with a scruffy beard, wearing a dirty jacket, pushing a basket, he's drunk or he's mumbling to himself. That's a homeless person.
They give you a physical description.
Right.
Yeah.
And I show them a picture of, you know, Angelica, who's up on my wall right now, who's this beautiful little girl. And I go, she was homeless too. Doesn't fit your description. She and her sisters didn't have a home, and they stayed in our shelter.
A number of years ago, we began to focus on this subset of those children, the children most at risk of aging out of foster care. So they've been in care for years, they've been freed for adoption, and then they turn 18, and that's the point at which they're released from the system, and the systems had failed them and hadn't found an adoptive family for those children. And that's about 20,000 children each year. So year over year over year, those children age out of foster care. The Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption stepped in and said, there's got to be a better way to serve these children. It is the birthright of a child to have a family, right? It's the legal and moral obligation of the systems that surround them to find them a family. And miserable failures 20,000 times year over year on the system's part that we didn't find them a family. So we created this model that we decided as a national nonprofit grant-making organization, we could dedicate our resources to this target population of children.
If you end up out of foster care at 18 and aged out, which means nobody ever wanted you, you didn't get connected to any family and anything. You have to look up the numbers, but I believe it's something like 60% up homeless in the first year, like 2/3 end up in jail, 10% manage to graduate high school, 2/3 end up on drugs. They have their kids taken away at enormous rates. That's another policy. They make up these policies. Say these foster kids, let's have money for the ones who are doing well. We want to reward. So if they're in college, we'll give scholarships. That money goes unclaimed because you find two people in all of Los Angeles because it's not meeting them where they're at. Where they're at is so terrible, the outcome for these kids.
Different psychiatrists that are involved in this sort of stuff, and they both came up with different studies and whatnot, but it was somewhere in between 40 and 60, so we'll just say 50% of children that age out end up homeless.
Yep.
Chronic homeless.
Yep, chronic.
Not homeless for 2 months, homeless for 5 years.
Right.
So if it's 20,000 a year, that means you're adding to a pool of homelessness in urban environments, 10,000 a year, 100,000 every decade.
Over year. And the one study that we go back to all the time is that first year out of care, 1 in 5 children are homeless, and those are the ones we know about. That first year, they exit the system and they're homeless. Those are the ones, we're not accounting for the ones that have a friend and they're couch surfing and they go somewhere else on their couch. They just don't have someplace to live. Absolutely. We have got to stop the madness. Here's what we know. By the time a child turns 9 in care and they've been freed for adoption, their likelihood of being adopted decreases significantly. So children age 9 and older, children in sibling groups, children with special needs, children who've been in and out of care for so long that they've given up hope on themselves, they've given up, and they push back when efforts at permanency are applied to them. So we focused on that. We created a model that said there's got to be a better way. We looked around the country and asked, why is it that children are aging out of care in your community? What is it that you're not doing, or what is it that you're doing but's not effective in getting these children adopted? And at the time, the default method of getting these children adopted was public displays. Put their faces on a website and hope that charismatically someone who's looking at how to adopt sees this website and sees these children and says, there, that's my child. a catalog of children. And sometimes it works, but for this target population of children, again, older youth, children in sibling groups, children with special needs, typically a family that jumps into this arena of I'd like to adopt a child doesn't look at a website and see a sibling group of 3 ages 8, 12, and 15, one of whom has been in and out of the juvenile detention center perhaps, and say, there's my ideal family, right? Because we carry these myths and misperceptions about who these children are. They're too old, too damaged, too dangerous, when they're simply reacting to the systems that have failed them and surrounded them for years. So we created this model that said, you can't just put their picture on a website and hope that they will get adopted. That's not effective. And is that how you would want your child in a system? If your child had to go in the system, is this how you would treat your child? And so we created what we call a child-focused model, a child-focused recruitment model. And what it says is just do good social work. And what we would do is give grants to organizations, large or small, public or private, to hire a full-time adoption professional who would carry a small caseload of the longest waiting children in their community and do a number of things. First and foremost is create a relationship with that child. If a child's been in care 5, 6, or 7 years, they remember former foster parents. They have a range of adults and families that surround them already, best friends, coaches, teachers, therapists. They have a number of adults in their circle already that they relate to, that they understand, that they care about, and who care about them. And so by developing this relationship with the child, the full-time adoption professional we call a recruiter, not only begins to gain the trust of the child, but begins to learn this sort of forensic journey of where this child has been and who has surrounded them, and they become potential adoptive resources. And then the recruiter also does a deep dive into the case file, so the agency has kept a case file logging everything that's happened to this child along the way, every court hearing, every placement, every movement to and from their home, who's in this child's life. And then they do what we call a diligent search. They may use technology tools or just through the digging through the case file, and begins to reach out to extended family members, best friends, families, whatever it is, and begins to identify real potential adoptive resources for this child, someone who already cares about this child. And then the recruiter goes and begins to make those connections, prepares the child for what is this adoption journey going to look like, prepares the family for what has this child experienced. Here are some challenges they may have experienced along the way. In other words, setting the real stage for what does it look like to bring this new family together. And then the recruiter stays with the family until it gets to a court hearing and the judge says this is a legal family. And frequently, quite honestly, the recruiters stick with the family post-adoption so that they help, because they have developed a relationship with the family, so that they can help with any challenges that may come along the way or any needs for resources. So it is really just good social work, but it wasn't good social work that was happening in the system for this target population of children and youth.
What's the workload of like a social worker, for instance? How many children do they have to oversee?
Somewhere between 30 and 50 children is what you hear in Los Angeles. I think that the best practice level, what's considered something manageable and where you can actually do a good job for everybody involved, is closer to 17 children.
17 is a good number, but 30 to 50 is what Los Angeles is.
And I mean, in Los Angeles, the numbers have been very beyond that basic best practice number for a long time. And the size of the foster care population in Los Angeles is very large because the county itself is very large. So the challenges of just the scale of it are huge.
The child-focused model of adoption developed by the Dave Thomas Foundation, 300% more effective than any other in successful adoptions of youth at risk of aging out, involving a light caseload for the social worker, as of 2020 has been brought to scale in 11 states throughout the country, as well as various regions in Canada. Once it is brought to scale in all states, and particularly those cities experiencing the highest rates of homelessness, it will prove to be the greatest preventative measure to the crisis out of any other program. However, for inclusion of those currently experiencing homelessness in the U.S. cities, the greatest challenge lies somewhere else.
While the minority of the homeless population suffers from mental illness, there is nonetheless a significant overrepresentation of severe and chronic mental illness in the homeless population. In the general population, usually around 1% of the population has schizophrenia, and about 6% of the population suffers from a combination of the severe mental illnesses, most notably schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and very severe depression. However, depending on the study and the estimate, you can say that anywhere from a fifth to a third of the homeless population suffers from severe chronic mental illnesses. And then either independent of or comorbid with major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia are the substance use disorders. Substance use is very overrepresented in the homeless population as well, both as a means of trying to deal with the other mental illnesses or as a disorder in and of itself. Schizophrenia is a general term that probably accounts for multiple similar but slightly different illnesses at a genetic or molecular level. The hallmark of schizophrenia, though, is psychosis, which is a combination of hallucinations, of delusions or false beliefs, and impairment in thinking. And it's probably better thought of as the schizophrenias, in that there's probably a host of different genetic and other insults that can conspire to create this condition.
Almost all of the complications of this illness are misunderstood or distorted by the general population. Some of the most burdensome symptoms only specialists are familiar with.
So schizophrenia, at one level, is a disorder of sensory perception and of sensory gating. Sensory gating pertains to the way that we focus our attention on the senses that are the most important at the time and what's most relevant within that sense. For example, in theory, you might be concentrating more on my voice right now than the ambient noise that we might hear outside the building. However, with people with schizophrenia, sometimes there's an equal access to all sensory experiences. So there's a difficulty in the brain to target or focus on the most relevant sensory stimuli. So my voice in the conversation might have equal opportunity with the other ambient noises or other things that we hear around the building. And that obviously is clouding and quite a challenge to navigate the world where all the sensory input may be getting equal time on stage.
Imagine having just this one symptom of the illness, and you're not speaking to an individual person in a quiet room. Instead, you're in a loud, chaotic urban setting where you're surrounded by gigantic buildings. The sounds of cars are honking and whizzing past you, the annoying pounding and drilling of construction. There is music from a far-off radio. Trucks are unloading their deliveries. Perhaps it is raining, and the pattering of droplets on the streets are echoing off of everything. There are pedestrians, birds, trains, sirens, vendors, and on top of all of this, a frustrated person is speaking to you. Maybe they think they're trying to help you in some way. Imagine you couldn't tune out any of the other sounds around you. That individual's voice has no more significance than any of the other noises. And that's just one of the symptoms.
In some ways, the city becomes the worst possible environment for someone suffering with this illness. They are bombarded by strangers. They have a tremendous need to be both flexible and conforming through hundreds of interactions in just the course of one day. Contrast that with a village setting, even in an underdeveloped nation, but where your community usually ends up about 250 or so people, and that's who you're going to interact with.
That's why people with schizophrenia do better in third world countries than they do in America. because they aren't excluded and intolerant. They have ways of staying within their families, staying and having roles, being able to herd sheep or do around stuff.
You're going to interact with them every day. They all know you. You know them. These things help the functioning of someone struggling with schizophrenia. And it's one of the rare instances where you might sometimes be better off having an illness in a place with far fewer resources than when you think of the resources that, in theory, the great American city should have.
Not only is the city an overwhelming place for those suffering from this illness, but some experts feel that the traditional model of care does not produce inclusive results.
My point isn't that medical model is bad and rehab and recovery and community integration is good. Is can't medical things be a tool for community integration, for rehabilitation? Medicine is something you use instead of something you're forced to take. Medicine is something that promotes roles in life instead of stigmatizing you, isolates you from roles in life. And that's been my job along here, is to be a psychiatrist without taking away their humanity, without making all the people back into patients.
While there are medications that treat and contain schizophrenia, there are no treatments that cure it. So these medications, even if they optimize someone's functioning and thinking, they have to be taken for life. So far, we have not found any intervention that can be done one time or for one course, and that's it, you're done. So they have to be taken every day. And people actually have trouble adhering with almost any medication every day. I mean, if you just look at an antibiotic prescription in general, who finishes their course of antibiotics? All the strep throats and pneumonias and bronchitis. Well, when you look at people's bottles, they've always got pills left over.
So the normal medical model says you give people meds in order to treat symptoms and illnesses. This one says you give meds in order to have a better life. What's the goal this is helping? So for example, a guy comes to see me and says, so hey doc, I'm hearing voices, can you help me? I'm like, well, maybe. Why do you care about hearing voices? What difference would it make you like if you weren't hearing voices? He says, well, I'd like to date women. I said, yeah, so would I, but my wife objects. What does that have to do with hearing voices anyhow? And he says, well, every time I try to date a woman, the voices say, you're fat, you're ugly, you're stupid, you're no good, who are you fooling? She's never going to go out with you, and I get so intimidated I don't even bother to try.
The voices are typically multiple. They typically are of both genders. And they tend to not have anything very nice to say in general.
They're not supportive?
Not really. Actually, almost never are the voices supportive in schizophrenia. They're exclusively either derogatory, insulting the person, demeaning the person, perhaps undermining a nicer thing that another person just said about them. They can be command hallucinations, but again, they're never inspiring or good advice. They never tell you to start an exercise program. The voices typically are destructive.
That makes sense to me. I got it. By the way, I don't think that's your only problem in dating women. If you were like a little cleaner, that would help. If you had some money to take her out with, that would be really sweet. If you had like a place to bring her back to, or at least a car with a big back seat, you might get some. That would be good. But we can work on all this all the time. I don't have to first treat a schizophrenia in order to do these other things. We can work all at the same time.
And it's most common auditory hallucinations. Their voices. Very often in the media or in film, it's difficult to depict that in a visual medium. So we often incorporate images when we depict someone who's suffering from schizophrenia, where we see a person that might be speaking to them. But that's not really the experience for most people with schizophrenia. It's possible, but fairly rare, that anyone sees anything. What they instead hear are voices that are with them wherever they go. And this obviously is quite disconcerting.
I do have some pills that might help with these voices. And I run through a list of different pills. They all might help in different ways. They got different side effects. What would you like to try? Also, you the kind of person who likes jumping into the deep end with a big dose and see if it knocks out those voices and you got a date by next Saturday, or you want to put your toes in slowly and try a little dose and see how your body responds and take longer to get there? What do you want to do? Meaningful education, meaningful choice, so he's learning to use his meds to pursue his goals, not me forcing it for an illness he probably doesn't think he has. So he chose 5 milligrams of Haldol at bedtime. When he comes back the next time, and that in itself is an accomplishment. Only a third of people come back a second time after we do our wondrous welcoming. My first question is, did you date any women? Remember, this is about having a better life. He says, no. I said, why not? He said, it was your fault, Doc. He says, well, it's those pills you made me take. The pills I made you take? You mean the pills we thought might help you get a date work backwards somehow? I said, I saw you down there doing a little day labor. You had $20 in your pocket. Why didn't you ask anybody out? What happened? He said, well, it's those pills. All right, tell me, what happened with the pills? He said, well, I've got to hand it to you on one thing. The voices are much quieter now. There's a little whisper back in the back of my head. That's pretty good. But now I'm shaking so like this, and I'm too embarrassed to talk to anybody, so I certainly wouldn't ask a woman out like this. Now, as an illness treater, I did not a bad job. I got his illness, he's got less symptoms, he's got a little bit of shaking, so what? Little side effects, who cares? He does not have a better life, he's no closer to his goal, he is not going to refill this pill or take any more of it. I said we have some other choices. We can add another pill that helps with the shaking, might give you dry mouth and blurred vision, I could try a different pill that might do less shaking, or here's a choice that only appears from a person-centered model. I can lower the medicine, intentionally making the voices a little worse and making no shaking, because that gets you closer to your goals. This isn't the State Department mental hygiene scrubbing the world clean of mental symptoms. The goal is to be as functional as possible. Once again, what do you want to do? Make another choice, come back.
It's really an unbearable illness, untreated. Fortunately, there are treatments for schizophrenia, and many patients can do pretty well. But what they require is adherence to the medications, adherence to other psychosocial treatments. That can be very hard to do. People with schizophrenia often have, there's something that, I don't know if it's as popular today, but it was always referred to as the downward drift theory. That an individual with schizophrenia just starts to drift downwards in society, that all forces are aligned to fall lower and lower. So that people are less likely to have income, they're less likely to have friends and other community contacts, they're less likely to have transportation, all these things, the poor get poorer. So even though there are treatments, how can they be accessed with no resources, with no transportation, with no people really willing to help you because they're either afraid of you or you've burnt those bridges. So it's very hard. It takes a lot to keep your social status with schizophrenia. Now, born into a circumstance where you have a community that understands the illness, that gets on it early, that helps you get the treatment, then you can work, you can have a family. I mean, all those things are still possible, except in the most severe manifestations of the illness. But you need a lot of things lined up to help you. There's no getting past that. The presence of severe mental illness, even more so when it's compounded by substance use. These are the least among us. There is no demographic that is more stigmatized, that is more on the margin than those with mental illness. And whereas mental illness can often predispose to substance use, then that combination becomes sort of this supremely condemnable population whose behaviors might be frightening. And with that element of substance use, the liability is all transferred to the individual.
So I think the religion plays a very important role in terms of bringing the social fabric and then kind of saying that, like, look, we have a role to play even in terms of addressing the social issues in the country. So I think spirituality is critical and it's important, and I see that more and more. People are talking about make in India, for example. What the new Prime Minister is talking about, not made in India, make in India.
Religion's like, it's like the glue that holds everything together.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mumbai seems to be in a constant state of ceremony and worship. Each city throughout India has their favorite of the Hindu gods. In Bombay, it's Ganesh, the remover of obstacles. Every year they celebrate the Ganesh Chaturthi in honor of him. Throughout a period of several days, hundreds of thousands of clay idols varying in size from a child's toy to a few stories tall are displayed in homes and stages throughout the city and worshipped through prayers and offerings and fasting. At the end of this process, they're all marched down the streets by a group of over 1 million participants. They're brought onto the beaches and submerged into the Indian Ocean. This ritual is like a social meditation in which the community harmonizes with one another. There's no comparable example of a country with that amount of economic and social struggles that brings with it that level of love and hope and compassion. And North America probably hasn't been as infected with political and social division since the Civil War. While they carry on with an atmosphere of celebration and unity driven by some divine connection, we seem to be in an era of anger and frustration and hatred with an absence of a common moral code. Because of this, our community tends to adopt a massive diffusion of responsibility. What can one person do? So they all give up. Painting our cities with this cold, hollow atmosphere where the most disenfranchised are an annoyance rather than a community responsibility. And cities are important. They're integral to the wealth of our states and nations. In many cities and townships throughout the country, you aren't allowed to be homeless. So for those who can't pay rent, they travel to the cities where you can sleep on the street. Homeless migration here is an issue as well. Everyone throughout the country can help alleviate the struggles the larger cities choose to take on. There's an increasingly toxic mentality towards America's homeless population. A common rationalization by many of the public is that in a rich country, people must be living on the streets out of choice or laziness, whereas in a poor country, life is much harder and there is no choice of their place in society. Here is the question one should ask. Would you rather spend a night on the streets of Los Angeles or a night on the streets of Bombay? Asking those questions really starts to make one rethink the greatest humanitarian crisis facing our megacities in the West. These folks on the streets of Western cities lack connectivity. Their families may be gone or have abandoned them, or in many cases they never had one. And their new relationships tend to be repeatedly destructive, making it near impossible to trust anyone. We're tribal and social creatures by nature. We're not meant to make it on our own. We need each other. It's an ironic advantage that the poor of the cities of the East often have. The streets are not only a lonely place here in Los Angeles, but a dangerous one, more so than almost anywhere else. Although we may be the richest country, the byproduct of our war on drugs has made our cities and cities throughout the Americas the most violent in the world. Just think, out of the top 50 cities globally with the highest homicide rates, 4 of them are in the United States, and Mexico, our bordering country most impacted by our war on drugs, has 19 of them. Other than South Africa, all the rest are in the Americas.
So you're going to force people who don't want to live in a place, you're going to force them. I think that's called prison. What are you actually saying? What are you going to end? With who? And how are you going to do that? And where are these 60,000 units of housing going to be?
Unfortunately, that would be the final solution to the homeless epidemic in Los Angeles. Everyone that has a tent on the street is rounded up and thrown in an internment center somewhere. Or they are driven out of the municipal region, as many of the surrounding suburbs currently drive them towards the inner city. Whatever the case may be, the final solution of ending homelessness permanently would require force. And it's worth mentioning because something like that might actually take place someday. The community may get fed up with what they don't want to look at and what they don't want to try to understand and demand that solution. The language is moving in that direction. It's no longer about helping individuals get off the streets or preventing them from ending up on the streets, but rather the streets are filthy and those things are the source of the filth. These are human beings, not inanimate numbers on a chalkboard that can be plugged into an equation that will result in success. You can't just batch process them. Housing is critical to address the issue, but as the child-focused model of adoption has proven far more effective than the traditional catalog approach, the community should start shifting its energy from a housing-oriented model to combat homelessness, and more towards the human-oriented one. Solving the crisis each individual is experiencing as opposed to the crisis as a whole. It's going to require mentorship and sponsorship, a great deal of one-on-one human-to-human interaction, case by case.
It's time to take care of the people. It's time for our legislatures and our officials to step up. Pull up your sleeves, humble yourselves, and come to our community and speak with us. Come to the table.
More focus towards prevention would probably prove to be more effective, because keeping someone off the streets is far easier than helping them back into society.
If we don't engage the community, I think we won't be able to find a solution.